Live now is Republican Senator Rand Paul. He's running in the primary for Republican candidate for the President of the United States. So welcome to the show, Senator Paul. Appreciate you calling in.
Thanks, Ring. Thanks for having me on.
Yesterday, you were in Grand Rapids, Michigan with Congressman Justin Amash. Why don't you inform my listeners on what that was all about?
Well, Justin and I are both, from the Liberty movement, the Liberty part of the Republican Party that believes that the Bill of Rights, the whole Bill of Rights, ought to be defended. And so he's a longtime friend, and he endorsed me for the nomination yesterday. We were quite happy to have that.
I wanted to ask you a few questions. One real quick one on foreign policy, and then we'll go to domestic, because I know you probably get hit with a lot on foreign policy. But what can you spell out to my listeners here in the state of Michigan? What do you think are the most severe short and long-term threats to the U.S.? And what do you think about the foreign policy goals to address that?
Well, I think the most important thing in defending the country is that we need to have what Reagan talked about. I'm a Reagan Republican. I believe in peace through strength. And that means that you need a strong enough military to deter attack and a strong enough military to repel attack. But then you also have to have the good sense to know when war is in our best interest and when intervention is not in our best interest. And so I'm a big believer that we should think before we act, and that there have been some interventions in recent history that have actually made us less safe. I would say Hillary's war in Libya was a disaster. We toppled a secular dictator. We got chaos, but then we got the rise of radical Islam. Now a third of Libya actually pledges allegiance to ISIS. And so I think we're worse off because of that war, and we should have thought about it before we got involved. There are times, though, I think that we should be involved. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. After 9/11 and actually before 9/11, we should have been doing everything to thwart Osama bin Laden. And I do think that the intervention in Afghanistan was justified. I also think now that the intervention against ISIS is justified, but I would do it with a vote of Congress, because our founding fathers intended that Congress initiate war, not the president. And I am somewhat dismayed that ISIS has grown stronger as more and more of their arms are actually American or Saudi Arabian arms that they're using against us.
So your foreign policy would be, for lack of a better term, try to be smarter about it in regards to when to intervene and when not to.
I would call it conservative realism, and I think there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum from being nowhere any of the time, and I'd call that isolationism. But there's also the opposite end of the spectrum. That's that we're everywhere all the time. I would say that where we go in the world and what we do in the world needs to be done with great thought, with great debate, and with an understanding that sometimes intervention gives unintended consequences. And so, for example, a year ago, they asked whether we should send arms into the Syrian civil war, send arms to the Islamic radicals, many of whom were allied with al-Qaeda, many of whom the experts admitted would fight alongside al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I said, it's a big mistake. I said, the irony is we'll be back in a year to fight our own arms. And sure enough, arming the Syrian rebels was a bad idea. There's also about 1 million Christians in Syria, and they're protected by Assad. And you ask them who they'd rather have as their leader, they'll pick Assad any day over ISIS. And so some of these conflicts, we don't fully understand the ramifications of toppling one dictator and what might replace them. And I think radical Islam is more of a threat than Assad is to us.
All right, let's go to domestic policy real quickly. Online with me is a Republican candidate, primary candidate for president, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. On domestic policy, today you are more than any other Republican currently have attempted to engage with the African American community. Do you think that you made progress in convincing them and other minorities to be receptive to your message? And what is your message to this minority community in the context of obviously the recent events with Baltimore, New York, and Ferguson regarding the police as well as the broader issues, really, of poverty, education, and development of opportunity in the inner cities, which is causing, well, we're being told, causing these issues?
Well, one of the things, the message I brought to Detroit on several occasions has been that we need economic opportunity in our big cities. And one way to do it is to take an idea that Jack Kemp originally had, enterprise zones, and make them even bigger and bolder. So I have a plan called economic freedom zones. And what we do is, for a city like Detroit, we cut taxes dramatically, $1.3 billion over 10 years, and that stimulates the city. That helps the city to pull themselves up out of bankruptcy, to really bail themselves out. And I think that is a way consistent with the Republican platform, but it is a plan for some of our big cities. I don't think the Democrats have a plan, and I think most other Republicans don't. So I'm one of the few that has a plan for helping to Detroit to rescue themselves. But I also believe that we should also be the party that protects the entire Bill of Rights. Just about everybody in our party is a good defender of the Second Amendment, myself included. But I think we also need to defend justice, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the fact that you should get a speedy trial. And one of the stories I tell, which I think is disheartening, is of a 16-year-old black kid in the Bronx who spent 3 years in prison without a trial in Rikers, some of it in solitary confinement. He attempted to commit suicide. And I tell people, look, if we as Republicans want more people to listen to our message, we need to defend the Sixth Amendment, the right to a speedy trial, just as strongly as we defend the Second Amendment.
How can I and others, I'm a white guy, try to convince minority communities that conservatism is a better way, policy-wise, to improving our lives?
I think the way to do it is you have to engage in a dialogue. You have to go to people where they are, where they live, and you have to understand what their life is like. So I try to understand Kalief Browder's parents and what they must feel like if I ask them if justice is fair. You know, the bail for this young man was $3,000. Many of your listeners could come up with $3,000 and get their son out of jail. This family was poor and couldn't. And so you can see how they think there's a different set of justice for being poor and black in the Bronx. And unless we understand that, we'll never understand the unease and the discontent in some of our big cities now. None of this justifies violence, but you can see how there is an anger. And if we don't understand some of that anger, I think we're doomed to a situation that worsens.
And lastly, what is your position, something that's near and dear to my heart and many of my listeners, on the fair tax?
I'm for any tax that lowers the burden. I don't really care to be for something that's revenue neutral. I want there to be less money in Washington and more money in the hands of the people. I have not been a big advocate of the fair tax. I'm not opposed to it. I haven't been a big advocate of it because I think it's going to be very, very hard to get the huge numbers of those in the working class to say they want a sales tax instead of an income tax, because currently most of the working class don't pay an income tax. So really, I'm actually looking at something that's a little bit different. I'm looking at a business tax that gets rid of the corporate tax, but also gets rid of the payroll tax. And I think if you did that, all of a sudden the working class would say, hey, that's something I can get behind, is lowering my taxes. So if you want to lower taxes for people, but then you say, well, I'm not going to have anything that lowers the tax for the working class, it's just hard to sell to the American people. So it's not so much I'm opposed to the fair tax, just I can't conceive of a way really to sell it to the American people.
From one of my listeners in Kalamazoo, what are your thoughts, something near and dear, I believe, to your father's heart, on auditing the Federal Reserve? And if elected, how would you achieve that goal?
I'm the lead co-sponsor of the Audit the Fed bill, and I'm hoping to get a vote sometime in the next month or so in the Senate. I don't think we have the votes to pass it yet. So we have to continue fighting, talking, educating, and seeing if we can get more Democrats on board. We have probably 3/4 of the Republicans in the Senate on board, but we're still missing about a fourth of them. And then we only have one Democrat at this time. So it's going to take some work. But I think the argument for transparency is a strong one, and the argument that people, particularly wealthy special interests, shouldn't be using the central banking system to enrich themselves at the expense of the middle class.
I'm surprised anybody would be against transparency, but apparently there are people out there. Online with me is Republican candidate in the primary for President, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today here on the Live
All
with
right,
Rank Show.
thanks.